Well, hey everybody, welcome to week 3 of Who Invited This Guy? It's a series where we're taking a look at several different meals Jesus shared with different people, mainly from the Gospel of Luke in the Bible. We have much to learn from what happened around those meals, and so I'm really glad you're tuning in. To start with today, I got an occupational question for you. Think back to a time, maybe it's when you were growing up, maybe it's now if you're on the younger side, but think of a time when you would dream about what you might do vocationally when you grew up. I mean, what is it you wanted to be? Maybe you wanted to be somebody in uniform, perhaps a fireman or a police officer, maybe serve in a military capacity. Maybe you thought about becoming an artist or actor, a singer, a writer, some kind of artistic thing. Perhaps in the healing profession, like a doctor or a nurse or surgeon, something like that. Maybe a therapist or counselor. Some of you might have dreamed of owning your own business, being a contractor maybe where you create something from nothing, being the boss, or maybe you thought about being a teacher or a professor. Or maybe the only thing you dreamed of was being a professional athlete, maybe going into coaching at one point. How many of you remember saying, I want to grow up to be a tax collector? Yeah, probably no one. I mean, maybe an accountant or a financial advisor, but not a tax collector. Tax collectors are never popular in any society. And today we're going to look at the story of a tax collector from the Bible, from the 19th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. If you have a Bible in some form, get to Luke 19. But here's the guy we meet, and here's his story. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. All right, from just these few verses here, we already know a fair amount about Zacchaeus. We know that Zacchaeus understood money. He got money. He was good at money. He was highly motivated by money. And we know this because Israel was occupied by Rome, and Rome had learned when they would occupy a country, hey, don't exile the people. Just leave most of them there, but tax them. And then Rome would get a lot of money from them. And that meant they would need from that people a few folks who would serve as tax collectors because those would be the people who knew where the wealth was. A tax collector would be somebody in Israel who could say, hey, this guy's got 50 sheep, they got 50 head of cattle, 100 acres. You could get a lot of money out of them. If I'm a rich Israelite, I'll go to a guy like Zacchaeus and say, hey man, don't tell Rome about all my money. And then Zacchaeus, the tax collector, typically would say, well, all right, but if you want me to be quiet about it, you're going to have to pay me off because I have to give him something. And then often the tax collector would still go ahead and tell the Romans anyway. That's Zacchaeus' game. So understandably, people in Israel didn't like tax collectors because they colluded with Rome. And Zacchaeus wasn't just an ordinary tax collector. He was good at it. I mean, he was, Luke tells us, the chief tax collector. And that meant he had other tax collectors working for him, and he was over a wide geographical area. So he was rich. And it's fair to assume that he was thoroughly corrupt and dishonest, and that nobody liked him. He kind of given up on society, on friendships, on moral decency and integrity. He'd given up on all that. He was betting everything on affluence and wealth and possessions. That those were the things that would give him meaning and fulfillment and happiness for his life. He had bet everything on that, and it wasn't working for him. There was a hole in his life and in his heart that money and affluence and some measure of power could not fill. And then he hears that Jesus is going to come his way. I mean, Jesus is going to come to Jericho. And there's something about Jesus that intrigues Zacchaeus. And it's not hard to figure out what it was. Because as we looked at last week, Jesus was somebody who befriended all kinds of people who, for whatever reason, were shunned or looked down on, especially by religious people. And Jesus went to a party for tax collectors. He hung out with tax collectors. He shared meals with tax collectors. I mean, Joe talked about that episode out of the 5th chapter of Luke. And by the time we get here to Luke 19, it's been about a year later, and word has spread. Word about something like that gets around. It's not the kind of incident that gets hushed up. Jesus goes to parties for tax collectors. And if that wasn't enough, one of Jesus' followers, Levi, is a former tax collector himself. So Zacchaeus is very curious about this guy, this moral teacher, this religious leader who hangs around with people like him. And what Zacchaeus doesn't know, but he's about to find out, is that the arrival of Jesus means that Zacchaeus is going to have to face up to the truth about his own life. Verse 3 tells us this: Zacchaeus wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. All right, you'll notice in this story, there are a lot of interesting little details. See, it's not just a tree, it's a sycamore fig tree. Luke makes sure to tell us not just that, but that Zacchaeus is short. Some of you might remember an old children's song about Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. You may have heard that song before, but nobody likes to be a wee little man. And maybe that's part of why Zacchaeus was so drawn to money. Money kind of makes you feel big. Money can make you feel like somebody. Money will make people look at you like you must be somebody. But it's kind of wearing off for Zacchaeus, like it always does. All that he's acquired and acquiring more of, it's not doing the trick for Zacchaeus anymore. And then the most amazing thing happens. And we got to picture this scene here. When you're a tax collector, you're not going to be a popular guy, and people are not going to, likely make a way for you so that you can see. And you don't want to hang out with the crowd. There's liable to be a fair amount of shoving and pushing and cursing for any tax collector that would be foolish enough to show up. Well, Zacchaeus knows this, but he wants to see Jesus. And he's short, so he runs ahead and he climbs up a tree to see over the crowd. And I think he probably climbs up the tree for another reason too, to get away from the crowd, because he wants to hide. Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, but he also wants to hide. That's the dynamic that's going on there. And then the Bible says in verse 5, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus. All right. Zacchaeus wasn't really counting on this. Now, put yourself in Zacchaeus' place for a moment and go up into that tree. Zacchaeus is sitting in that tree, and Jesus is getting closer and closer. And Zacchaeus is thinking, hey, this is a good idea I had. I'm going to get a good look at Jesus. I may even be able to hear a fair amount of what he says. And Jesus gets closer and closer and closer. And all of a sudden, he's not only close, he's standing right there beside the tree you've climbed up. And he's not just standing beside the tree, he's also looking up into the tree. And there's a whole crowd of people with hundreds and hundreds who see Jesus. And they start looking up in the tree and asking each other, well, what's he looking at? And they're like, I don't know. Is that a squirrel he's looking at? I mean, maybe it's a chipmunk. Might be some kid up there, perhaps. Maybe it's where the quarantine ravens are hiding. Who knows? But he's looking at something up in that tree. And then Jesus says his name, Zacchaeus. And that one name, that one word sets off a ripple through the crowd. Imagine for a moment how Zacchaeus feels. He thinks he's going to hide in a tree and watch from a safe distance. And all of a sudden, Jesus and everybody else, well, they're looking up at him sitting in that tree. And so the crowd by now is buzzing. And I'm sure they're now thinking, all right, Jesus is going to let Zacchaeus have it. I mean, this is going to be good. This is going to be bloody. Finally, a tax collector is going to get what's coming to him. But instead, Jesus says, Zacchaeus, will you come on down out of that tree? And he says, I must stay at your house. This is the end of verse 5 there. Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. And this is another detail that Luke draws out. Jesus doesn't say, I want to stay at your house, or I'd like to stay at your house. He says, I must. And Luke wants us to understand that there's a necessity to what Jesus is doing and that God is at work behind it all. This is the kind of thing that Jesus must do in order to reveal the radical nature of the grace of God. I must do this, Jesus says. And nobody saw this coming. I mean, if Jesus was just an ordinary good religious teacher, then you'd expect him to say something like, hey, Zacchaeus, if you'll clean up your life, change professions, pay back what you owe, straighten things out, then I'll come to your house. But I can't come now, Zacchaeus. I won't come now. It looked like I'm condoning you, and I can't afford the criticism it will cause me. If you'll clean up your life, then I'll come, Zacchaeus. Jesus doesn't say that. He says, Zacchaeus, I want you to hurry up and come on down, for I must stay at your house right now. You see, Jesus always leads with grace. Always grace. You know, whatever your secret is, whatever you're hiding, whatever you struggle with, you can trust him. You can come to him with anything because of the grace that he brings with him. Well, Jesus pays a considerable price for leading with grace. Verse 7 tells us that all the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Now, again, Luke goes out of his way to tell us this little detail in the response, and he tells us that it was widespread. See, quite often in the Bible, Jesus does stuff that'll tick one group off or another, and so people mutter. You know, sometimes the Pharisees mutter, sometimes the Sadducees mutter, sometimes the religious leaders mutter. But this is the only time in all the New Testament that we're told all of the people mutter at what Jesus did, because nobody likes a tax collector. Jesus is going to the home of Zacchaeus, a tax collector? Seriously? What in the world is happening here? What's the world coming to? And wouldn't you love to know what the conversation was like at Zacchaeus' home around Zacchaeus' table? I don't know for sure, but I wonder if Jesus said something like, Zacchaeus, man, your whole life long you've been a money guy. You get money, you love money, but is it getting you where you hoped it would? Zacchaeus, there was a time when you had to walk everywhere because you had nothing, and then you became a tax collector, and you got really good at it. One day you could buy a donkey, and that was pretty cool, but then the thrill of the donkey kind of wore off, and then you thought, hey, I could get rid of my donkey and upgrade to a camel. And then eventually that new camel smell wears off, and the thrill is kind of gone, and now you have a whole fleet of camels. How many camels is it going to take, Zacchaeus? You know, you used to wear shabby clothes, and then you started getting some money and you bought a silk robe, and that was cool. Then you got another one, then another one, then another one, then another one. You have so many closets full of silk robes, you can't even wear them all. You're giving them away each year. How many robes is it going to take, Zacchaeus? You used to live in a tent, and then you got in a house, and then you bought riverfront property on the Jordan River. Now you have the biggest, nicest house in town, and that's not doing it for you anymore. How big does the house have to be, Zacchaeus? In other words, you can be satisfied with your money, but you can never be satisfied in your money. Only in God. You were made for God, Zacchaeus. Fulfillment, satisfaction, freedom. It's only found in God. Zacchaeus, you could find joy and contentment. You could surrender everything to me. You could follow me. You could be a generous guy. You could use whatever resources God has given you to do a whole lot of good in this great big old world. People would bless you instead of cursing you. I mean, these things are being shared, and these thoughts start going through Zacchaeus' head because Jesus and he are at a table, and he can't evade the truth any longer. He can't hide any longer. He comes face to face with the life he's built. You know, for Zacchaeus, so much of his brokenness was around money and dishonesty and greed. But let me ask you to imagine for a moment that instead of Zacchaeus, it's you in that tree. It's you around that table. And you want to see Jesus. I have a deep conviction that you wouldn't be tuning in if you didn't have a curiosity about Jesus. You, like Zacchaeus, you want to see him. And yet the truth about you and me is there's a part of us that's afraid to see Jesus because you know that your life or my life, we don't quite measure up. I want you to imagine that you are in the tree, half hoping that Jesus will see you and half hoping that he won't. And if Jesus were to come along right now and it was you who climbed up in the tree and Jesus calls your name and goes to your house and shares a meal at your table, the question for you is, what is it that Jesus would need to talk with you about? What is it in your life that you are most likely to hide? Well, this time with Jesus means that Zacchaeus has got to admit the truth about his life to Jesus. He's got to admit it to himself. And for Zacchaeus, he's got to admit it to a group of other people that he has wronged and hurt. So in a very dramatic moment in verse 8, Luke tells us this, but Zacchaeus stood up. Now, in the ancient world, at a dinner, hospitality and civility was a big deal. Often the host of a formal banquet at some point would stand and recognize all the people that were there, and he would give honor to the primary guest. So it's not really surprising, but Zacchaeus, when he stands up, he doesn't address the people. He doesn't do the kind of after dinner speech. He's just looking at Jesus. It's like for Zacchaeus, in that moment, it's only him and Jesus. And his heart's got to be pounding out of his chest. But he stands up and he says, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." I mean, that's incredible. And everybody, they're just staggered. Everybody's stunned. Mrs. Zacchaeus has got to be thinking, "Hey, I wish we would have talked about this before you stood up and said that." But Zacchaeus is so captivated by the possibility of a new way of life with Jesus and a new means to do something with his stuff that he recalculates everything in light of the kingdom of God. Zacchaeus, he stands up, he kind of puts a stake in the ground, and he says, "I'm giving away 50%. I believe that 50% of what I have with God is more than 100% with God." That's a pretty staggering thought. And he says, "And I'm going to make things right. I'll pay back people whom I've cheated 4 times the amount," which is way beyond what the law required him to do. Well, after Zacchaeus stands up and makes this declaration, Jesus stands up. And he doesn't do the after dinner speech either and talk about what a nice meal it was. He just looks right at little Zacchaeus. And I imagine by this time, tears are flooding down Zacchaeus' face, because we got to understand what's going on here. This is what Jesus says to him. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man, this wee little man, this despised little man, this tax collector, is a son of Abraham." Now, the language Jesus uses is not accidental. And there's a reason why Zacchaeus would remember this until the day he died. You can bet your life on that. If you were an Israelite, about the greatest phrase that could be used to describe you would be a son of Abraham or a daughter of Sarah. Abraham and Sarah are where Israel started. Zacchaeus, though, he's a corrupt tax collector who colludes with Rome. I mean, nobody's called him a son of Abraham for a long, long, long time. They've called him the son of something else, but not the son of Abraham. And he can't believe that Jesus calls him that, a son of Abraham. What an amazing thing to sit down at a table with Jesus where grace just flows. And Jesus says, "Zacchaeus, you're a son of Abraham now. Salvation has come to this house." And what he means is not Zacchaeus has bought his way into the good graces of God. I mean, you can't buy your way there. You can't earn your way in. It comes as a gift of grace. Jesus stopped by that tree way before Zacchaeus had done anything to merit anything. And his generosity was an indication of a change that had taken place deep in his heart. Now, that word salvation is often translated healing or deliverance. And it means now for Zacchaeus, that disease of acquisition and greed and deceit and cheating that's been corroding his soul is now being healed. That treadmill he's been on forever, well, he's getting delivered from it. And now Zacchaeus is a son of Abraham, a member of the children of God, not just physically or genetically, but spiritually, deep in his heart. Then Jesus says this to clarify his mission and who he is, in case anybody hadn't gotten it yet. Luke 19:10 says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." Reminds me of a guy named Yu-Gi-Oh! Shig. He's someone who sees people who are lost and sees people who need to be saved. It's been written about quite a bit, but Time magazine wrote about him not too long ago. Shig sees people lost at the Toshimbo Cliffs in Japan almost every day. He knows they're lost because they're not looking at the view. They don't carry a camera around. They don't have any souvenir gifts. They don't have anything. They just kind of hang their heads and stare at the ground. When Shig sees these lost souls, he approaches them with a smile and a simple hello. He might ask them about how they came to the cliffs and where they're staying. And if given the chance, he might lightly touch their shoulder. When he does this, Shig says the person he's talking to often breaks into tears because these people who come to the Toshimbo Cliffs with no camera and no souvenirs have not come to see the view. They've come to end their lives. The Dishimbo Cliffs are a well-known site for suicide. And Shig, who's a retired detective, knows this. And so several times a day, he patrols the cliffs, trying to prevent them from taking their lives. If he can talk them off the cliffs, he even invites them back to his office and invites them to share a meal with him. This one particular article details these important meals that take place. It says there's no rush in Shig's office. He offers those who go there a particular meal, a dish of pounded sticky rice served with grated radish. Traditionally, this food is prepared to celebrate the new year, with each family member taking its rice to be mixed with that of its neighbors. And Shig says when people come here and they eat this meal, they remember their childhood. They remember their father, their mother, their siblings, their hometown, and they remember they're not alone. And amazingly, these meals are working. It's estimated Shig has saved more than 700 people from committing suicide. And I love what Shig says. Listen to this. He says, I want Dishimbo to be the most challenging place, not where life ends, but where it begins. And that's something of what went on that day in Luke 19 when Jesus made his way to Jericho and stopped at that sycamore fig tree and essentially invited himself to Zacchaeus' house to share a meal with him. It was the start of a whole new life. See, the truth about Zacchaeus is that he was wretched and despised. He was filled with guilt. His life had been a waste, but he was only one step away from getting it all right. He was as lost as it was possible to be lost, but he was only one decision away from starting a whole new life in the kingdom of God. In CCC, you're never more than one step away from God. I don't know what it is that's going on in your life. I don't know where you're tempted to hide or what challenges keep defeating you. But I'll tell you, no matter how wretched that area of your life may be, and no matter how big it feels to you, you're only one step away. You're never more than one step away from God. You know, Jesus invites us to share a meal with him. We've got a metaphorical table of sorts where we share a meal with Jesus at the center of it all. It's called communion, and we make our way to communion every week. And we think about Jesus. Zacchaeus, you see, he was in an open place in his life because of the hopelessness that the path he was on was leading to. And I wonder if you're open too. And I wonder if there's any area of your life that Jesus wants to get your attention. You probably know exactly what it is. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Is this moment right here going to lead to a shift for you like it did for Zacchaeus? Because you're only one step away. So let's celebrate communion, a great time of reflection with a piece of bread and some juice pointing to the grace and new life offered to us because of Jesus.